Welcome everyone to our webinar today titled Implementing Collections Management Systems. I'm very excited to have you here today to learn about this topic together. My name is Emmanuel. I'm the Business Development Team Leader here at Lucidea, and I will also be moderating the webinar and your question today. Before we start though, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Number one, to make sure we get as much value from this webinar in the short period of time, our lines are muted at this moment. And secondly, we encourage you to go to the question and answer widget and type your question while you're listening to this webinar so that we can address them later on. And lastly, for those of you who may wish to revisit the webinar again, the recording will be posted at Lucidea. So Lucidea, for those of you who have not heard of us or might be curious, at Lucidea, we work with museum, archives, library, and other information professionals to provide better access and visibility to their collection. The company itself, or we, focus on bringing the best solutions from around the world, but we are comprised of a series of products and companies that have joined Lucidea over the last 30 years. And these brands include well-known products such as Argus, Sydney, InMagic, Archivera, Eloquent, and QuadraStar, as shown on the slide. Joining us today is an entrepreneur, an amazing information strategist. When I say amazing, I mean it. What's special about her is that she has over 20 years of experience in information work in national and international sector. She's an author, a certified archivist, a certified records manager, just to name a few of her roles and credentials. She believes in a bespoke approach to every project she works on. Today, she will be sharing her knowledge and experience on implementing collection management systems. Let's welcome Margot Note. It's good to have you here and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. So I'm excited to present today because I think this is the implementing your collection management system, I think is where the real excitement starts. You spend all this time thinking about your requirements for this new system and engaging with stakeholders and really getting a sense of your needs. And now your system is finally here and it's this really powerful tool. So what do we use and what do we do to really empower ourselves and empower the system? The first thing that you should think about when implementing a collection management system is assigning an administrator. This is super important. So when I was thinking about putting together this webinar, I was thinking back to a potential client meeting that I had. And this was before everything shut down, like literally my last meeting before the shutdown happened in New York City. And I was talking to them about a particular project, and they had mentioned that they're implementing a new database, and it was not related to archives, it was more related to fundraising. That I was familiar with. And I'd asked them, you know, who's going to minister this system? And they said, well, we all are. So it was the executive director and all members of staff. And so that kind of put up a red flag in my mind that, you know, if I decided to work with these people, I really had to address this, even though it was kind of outside the project we were particularly working on. Because when you have everybody in charge, no one's in charge. So with the collection management system, you need someone who is a full-time person who is responsible for the software and data. Now, they don't have to be a big techie person. They don't have to be necessarily a member of your IT staff or anyone that knows a ton about actually how the system gets implemented from that tech view. But they do have to be familiar with your collections, and they have to have a certain level of detail about how information should be organized. And you have to think about a database is not a democracy, it's basically a benevolent like dictatorship. You have one person in charge and they make the rules. And by doing this, everything is filtered through that one person. So it's not chaotic and the data is relatively clean and there's systems and processes for working with the system. It helps, having one person in charge helps maintain the data integrity of your systems and also helps troubleshoot the system. So if there's a particular problem, you have the one person that's the lead that might talk to a vendor or do some external research to fix that problem. And so everything goes through this one person. And I've, in past positions I've had where I've worked with databases or I had some level of system admin access, it really did make sense to have one, king or queen of the system and have all that information flow through them. I think sometimes, especially in organizations that have a very flat organizational structure and people are working, used to working very collaboratively, this kind of goes against that kind of collective work that you do, but it is very important. And I definitely want to stress this because having everything go through that administrator is going to really make your database powerful and make sure that you're using processes and procedures that make sense, that have some clarity. Now, this administrator also gives people access levels. So you have the system administrator that has, is all powerful, right? But then you have different levels of access, and that's dependent on people's roles and responsibilities. So the access levels define who can do what. So some members of your staff are going to have to be able to view, to add information, to edit information, and delete information, but not everyone should have all those powers, right? Some people purely need to view the system. They don't have to add or edit or delete. If they do have some changes, it might go through someone, but a majority of your users are just basically going to be viewing and perhaps adding information. And so these access levels disallow people from making changes in other people's purview. So for example, an archivist is not necessarily going to make changes in a conservator's part of the system, and vice versa, right? And then it also prohibits certain groups from seeing sensitive information. So if you have private information, sensitive information, information that's related to a donor that you don't want people to see, only the people that have access can see that information. And let's say someone who's working as an intern or a volunteer or another department won't be able to have access to that information. So then you keep up your security and privacy in doing so. So as you're implementing the system, you also have to think about the scheduling. What is this going to look like moving forward? How will you anticipate how long the implementation is going to take? Now that's dependent on the system that you get, if there's any configurations, the amount of data you have. There's a whole bunch of different factors that will obviously inform that schedule, but you want a realistic schedule and not an ideal schedule, because you have to think about anytime you're working on a project, you also have to do your day-to-day tasks. Most people, unless you're purely project focused, you're going to have your everyday operational duties that you've been hired to do, and then you have this project to do on top of it. And there's also other priorities within your organization. There's different scheduling or calendaring that happens within your organization. So you want to have a schedule that's realistic, that gives you enough time so you're not completely rushed. When you're implementing a system, you do not want to be rushed. You don't want to be lackadaisical, but you do want to have some cushion of time as issues come up. So think about scheduling that implementation in a way that's realistic and that you're kind of walking at a healthy pace and not necessarily running to implement it because you've decided on an unrealistic schedule. And as you're migrating data, you're most likely to be migrating information in waves. So sometimes if you have a very big project, you might have a pilot migration. So that's looking at a very small group of maybe departments or collections or something that a small group that you've put some type of boundaries around, that you're kind of testing what this looks like as you migrate to see what the problems are. And in time, as you get more familiar with the system, as you gain more confidence, you can increase those waves of migration over time so that you're confident that, okay, if you double the amount of information that's being migrated, you will have no problems, right? You don't want to just completely, unless you know for sure the data is super clean and everything is fine, which that would be wonderful. You don't want to just bulk migrate everything. You do want to be mindful and be cautious when migrating. And doing so in waves is probably the most prudent option. And once that migration happens, you want to make sure that you verify the system that it works in the way that's as intended. So, you've done your research, you've looked at how the system works, you've probably seen a demonstration using your own data, but then there's something about when it actually migrates, when you're in the real world, that you have to be mindful to make sure that everything is doing what it's supposed to do in the system. So during this time period, you're detecting issues that you find. You're identifying if there's any gaps between what you received and what was expected. And sometimes that's miscommunication, but I would think at this part of the venture, you would really know what you're looking for, but you do want to make sure that everything is how it should be. And then there might be an opportunity, if there's a huge gap between what's received and what's expected, to renegotiate, to adjust, or to modify what you're working on with the vendor. Um, this is kind of an interesting part of the process because it is really real. Until everything gets migrated and the system's up and running, it's kind of almost theoretical, and then it really happens. So you want to make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be and things are working the way as you intended. And part of this kind of managing expectations and making the system work the best is training. And training usually is not a one-off thing. There's usually a bulk of training that would happen um, when you first set up the system, where it's entirely new to people. People are eager to use the system, or maybe intimidated by the system. So there's that kind of big training that happens. But you do want to also have opportunities for questions and training in time too. It's not just you learn how to use the system and then it's done, right? It's a learning process. So training is important for your staff because it increases user acceptance, because people are using the system. Um, I think I've said in when I talk about collection management systems, certainly in previous webinars, that having a collection management system is a huge change for an organization. And there's a huge field about change management and how you can make people accept change. And change is very hard. We're used to doing things in a certain way, even if that certain way, like with using legacy systems or ad hoc ways of doing collection management, even if those ways were not ideal and maybe cumbersome and inefficient, there's a comfort in the knowing. Just as humans, that's just how our brains are created. We like to know things. We do not like change. We do not like new, even if the new is going to benefit us. So having training really talks to the people that are going to be using the system, and it gives them some buy-in where they feel like they understand the system. They're not so intimidated by the system. They can see how it can benefit them, how it's easier for them. And training also develops a common language, especially if you've had an old system. So the old way of doing things, or certain workflows and ways of processing information. And this new system is going to introduce a new language that people need to be familiar with, a new terminology, a new way of doing things. So it helps people really understand what that common language is for this new system. With training, you have to consider the different expertise levels. So there's certain members of your staff that uh, only have to view things. They want to see information. They want to know that they can access information, but they might not have to get into the they certainly don't have to get into the nitty gritty of how a system works. There are other people that are going to need much more deeper knowledge. So for example, the implementation team of the system and that system administrator are going to have that highest level of training and expertise, because they're going to have to know a ton of information about how the system works. Now, kind of a step lower from them are the power users. So those are the people that are going to be using the system. They might be the archivists, the lead processors of collections, where they're going to be in the system daily, updating information, creating finding aids, cleaning up information, arranging and describing things in a more detailed level. So those power users are going to need specific training that is targeted specifically for them. I think an interesting thing that to think about too is thinking about train the trainer. So that's when staff members get trained not only how to use the system, but then trained how to teach other people on staff how to use the system. And I think this is a really good way to get buy-in to using the system by staff members. It gives them a sense of purpose. It gives them a sense of leadership. And then they can teach their colleagues, and their colleagues can depend on them. And I think sometimes this can be there's various ways that you can do training where the vendor comes in, for example, and they do the training, or there's like webinars or wikis, or there's a variety of ways of doing training that's kind of led by the vendor, which I think is very important. But I think there's also something to be said about the peer training aspect, which I think really creates an incredible amount of buy-in by staff members. It gets people engaged. It's more sustainable because as questions happen, 6 months later, a year later, people can talk to each other and exchange information. And it's a way, I think, to make an organization stronger too. So training fundamentals, this is going a little bit more in detail into training. They should be taught according to the role or function. So again, thinking about someone who is a part-time staff member or an intern or a volunteer, or someone maybe that's in an associated department, might have to know some of the ways that the system works in a very specific way, but they're not going to have to know everything the way that a system administrator needs to. You want to make sure that the training is as targeted as possible. So really thinking about what are the tasks that these staff members do that they care about. And I think sometimes when the training is targeted to the work that people do, obviously it's more beneficial to them because everyone should have kind of the idea of, what's in it for me, right? So how can the system help me do my work easier? How can it be, how can I make less mistakes? How can I import material faster? How can I export material faster? How can I work with this system that I don't have to think about the details of things or kind of a obscure workflow that maybe perhaps you use for an old system? How can the system make my life easier? And that's the part of training that's targeted, that's super important. So once you have that kind of initial training, you also want to schedule follow-up sessions. So thinking about, people might be working with the system, it might make sense in that initial usage, but then later on, 6 months, a year, 3 months later, for example, they might have other questions. They might want to discuss how a process should be improved, or they run into a problem, or there's duplicates, or there's something that they find. So there should also be follow-up sessions. These can be brown bag lunches or webinars that you do, or kind of office hours where people can drop in. It really depends, I think, on the culture of your organization, but you should also, you should offer some type of follow-up sessions. And you want to have ways to address questions that arise after that initial use. So again, the follow-up sessions are a little bit more in depth, but people just might have questions about the system. Maybe it's as simple as making an FAQ of commonly asked questions about the system, or having something maybe on an internet in your organization that walks through some common processes or how to do something specifically. Just kind of reinforcing that message of the training over time, and acknowledging that it's not just a one-off thing. So you want to train as close to the date that the system goes live as possible. Now, again, the system, you might have an idea or a window when that system is going to go live, but obviously you want to have that training as near as the live date as possible, because people, once they get that training, are going to want to use it right away. That's a way to reinforce what they've learned. You don't want to just do training, 3 months, and then 3 months later have the system go live. You want to have it as close as possible, with also realizing that sometimes that's hard to schedule that. If people are distant, if you have various people that are not in one location, and certainly now in a time where so much more work is done remotely, there might be opportunities to use webinars and wikis to do this type of training. It doesn't have to be in person, even though sometimes I think that can be ideal. Sometimes it's just not going to happen. So it's also, I think, thinking about live training versus on-demand training. So there might be opportunities where you do want to get together as a group and do live training together, where you schedule a meeting time, you do the training, but then there might be also opportunities that you can troubleshoot and do on-demand, like little YouTube videos, for example, of like, this is how you enter this information, or this is how you make a finding aid. So when people want that information, maybe they forget parts of the process or they're a bit fuzzy, they can immediately access that information. One way to think about training is to have your colleagues complete tasks during the training. So thinking about their specific roles and responsibilities, what are things that they're going to have to use? What are the tasks that they're going to do repetitively in the system? So you can use that training opportunity to have them explore what that might look like. You also might want to give assignments to staff to work on independently. So basically, this is before you do the training, say, okay, here's the system. Basically throwing people in the deep end and seeing if they can figure it out. There is something, I think, elegant about that solution, because good collections management systems should have some level of being intuitive to users. And I know certainly I learned by kind of poking around and figuring it out on my own. So that might be helpful to have users, your colleagues, do that before that training session. But I think you also have to be mindful about how easily people get frustrated. If you have people that are open to new experiences, that have some level of tech savviness, this might work for them. And then you might also have people kind of test the system individually and then use that training session as problem solving. So they've kind of tested things out on their own, and then they come together and figure it out together and problem solve in the training. So I think what I'm trying to say here, and many bullet points, is that there's a variety of ways that you can approach training. And you should also make the training fit your organization, right? So I think there's traditional ways of lecturing and giving information, but I think especially with the internet and there's everyone's online, people are more open to different ways of learning how to use systems. And I think that's the real beauty of systems as well. So think about the resources that you can capitalize on. So for example, training materials might already exist. So maybe other institutions might have created really good training materials that they have available, or a vendor might come in with a huge amount of training materials. So it's not like you have to recreate, reinvent the wheel with your training. You might have a repository that you have a good relationship with that uses the same system, that might be a bit ahead of you in the implementation of a system, that they might be willing to share some of the information that they've created. And of course, whatever documentation you have or that you find, you can customize it to your organization. So again, we're kind of capitalizing on what's out there and then making it work for our organizations. So for the most part, I imagine, 80% of what most archives are doing, or there's a huge amount of overlap, and that 20% is what makes them very unique because of their specific collections or staff structure or kind of organizational culture. So you can use those resources that are already done and just customize it so it makes sense for your colleagues. So something else to think about that's part of implementation is thinking about workflows. And I was thinking about this recently because I was doing a training for a client, and we were talking about workflows related to archival processing. And I think workflows, especially with implementing a system, is important to think about as you're setting up the system. So think about the common workflows and tasks that your archives does. And you can approach this in all different angles, the ways that works for you. Um, and thinking about how to process things or how to do these workflows for these specific tasks. Figuring out the best way can be challenging. I think there's sometimes best practices, but then you also, again, have to customize it to your organization. So especially if this is a new system for you, maybe you've had a legacy system in the past, or you've had ad hoc ways of organizing collection information, let's say in a Word document, and a spreadsheet, and an Access database. You have specific workflows, the way that you do work, that's really dependent on these old antiquated systems. So now you have a new system. So the new system is going to help you get a better workflow, one would hope. But the software should not dictate those practices, right? So an ideal software system, or the purpose of technology, is to be used as a tool to help people. The people are driving the bus here, right? The technology isn't. So as you're implementing this system, you should be thinking about the workflows that are going to support the system. So, what does processing look like? How do you do acquisitions? How do you do better description or arrangement? How do you deaccession? How do you appraise things? How do you do reappraisal? So all these workflows you can figure out with your team to see, okay, what I always suggest is, if you can be in person, go into a conference room, for example, you have a whiteboard, and start writing down what these workflows are going to look like, or use post-it notes, or even in a virtual environment, there's sometimes these whiteboards in these meeting spaces that you can start to really talk through workflows. And sometimes it's staff members that have specific tasks that they do that they might have part of the workflows that they do. So you bring it all together, and then you think about, okay, does this make sense with the system? Are our ways of doing things making sense with our database? And I think this is a really powerful way of strategizing. And it's funny, it comes up now where in my own business, I'm thinking about so much of what I've done is just work, work, work. Like as an archivist, I was just processing, processing, processing. And I was a lone arranger at my last position, so I was doing everything. But I never really took that step back to really as much as I should have, to strategize about, like, why am I doing the things that I'm doing, and can I do it better? So I think implementing a new system is a real opportunity to take that step back and to really question what you're doing and if you can do it better. Now, there might be, you might find out that maybe you can't do things better, but I imagine with a new system, it allows you to think more creatively about how you're doing work, and again, maybe make things more efficient, make things less painful, kind of removing the friction of doing specific archival work. So defining those workflows is kind of deciding on the goal. So there might be a whole bunch of different things that you want to focus on, but let's think about one way of doing something. Let's think about processing. What does archival processing look like in a workflow using the system? So you have to obtain consensus about what needs to be addressed. Maybe everyone agrees, okay, processing seems to be very laborious. Let's see how we can make it easier. So you start identifying and prioritizing the tasks that are part of this process. You can create role-based responsibilities and assign them to individuals, so you know that certain people are going to be working on a certain part of, let's say, the processing workflow. And then together you map the new workflows. You can, have that system where you're just basically doing a brain dump of how people currently do the workflow. And then you can make adjustments, and then you can solidify that workflow in, any type of diagramming program that you want. And then you can adapt the workflows as circumstances change. So just because you thought about an ideal way of doing work, for example, using the system, you have to have some flexibility in how you approach it. So just something to think about, where I think this is a little bit off the beaten path as far as like this is how you implement a collections management system. But I think this is a perfect opportunity and the perfect type of tool to really think about, okay, now we have a new system. How can we make our processes better? How can we make our lives easier as archivists? So once the system is implemented, you want to review and verify what you have. So you want to run that legacy system post-migration for about 2 to 3 months. And that might be a legacy system or your ad hoc, Word documents or spreadsheets. You want to have some period of time where you're having basically two systems, just in case something should go wrong. So if there happens to be a failed migration, there's an alternative. It's not like you totally deleted everything. There might be information that was unable to be migrated for whatever reason, so you can still look back at that information, decide how you want to resolve it. If you still want to migrate it, what do you have to do to migrate it? And then having these two systems, at least temporarily, allows you to resolve problems in the new system as they come up. And then once everyone feels confident that, okay, this system is working the way that we want it to, the data is clean, everything's working the way that we want, then you can decide on decommissioning the old system. So you might entirely delete that system, or you might just kind of keep it kind of warehoused in a sense. But it is kind of a nice transition period where you've totally accepted this new system and it's up to the standards that you want. So you're going to be reviewing the data too. So you're checking the data as you're testing. You're reviewing data during and after migration, which I think is important. You're making sure everything migrates properly. You also want to ensure that colleagues are entering the new data properly. So whoever's your system administrator, which might be you or a colleague, there should be policies and procedures about how to enter data. So you should be looking at, is this information being entered properly? And it's best to catch those problems early, right? This is especially the case if you've had an old system and you've had a huge problem with having dirty data in that system, where if you've had to do a lot of cleanup before your migration, you want to make sure that like the idea is, there's a new sheriff in town and this database is really clean and there's certain ways of doing things, and you want to make sure that you keep that new data super clean and everything's done in its proper way. And then you can address the problems as they come up so you don't have to do that cleanup later. And I think maybe this is revealing the nerdy part of myself, but I love databases that have reports. So I use, for example, QuickBooks in my business. They have a number of these canned reports that, I just click a button, I, filter things, and I get these beautiful reports, right? But I know in that system, there's a bunch of other information that I want to keep track of. So I might have to use third-party programs for doing that. I know in the past when I worked with a fundraising database, we had a number of these reports that gave us a huge amount of information, but then we also used another software to create very customized reports that the director and the VP needed to look at that were very specific to their needs. So reporting is wonderful, especially in a new collections management system, because that reporting capability should be really robust. You should really be able to build reports, do exports, have a lot of power in that data. And then sometimes the reports go into Excel, Word, PDF, or any type of proprietary format. I think too, and I feel like this is the drum that I always beat when I'm talking about archives, is that you have to think about the people in power in your organization that have a difficult time understanding the value of archives. I think this is a problem throughout all organizations where, as archivists, I think we have a difficult time expressing our value, because I think it's for us at least, it's obvious that we have value. But I think the people that make decisions about hiring and budgets have a fuzzier way of understanding the value of archives. So I think, especially with reporting capabilities, you should be thinking strategically and kind of politically as well, to think about, with this new system, are there specific reports that you can create for people that you want on your side regarding this database? So especially for people that were supportive of this database, you want to prove, okay, this is a really good investment, right? But then there might be other people that are kind of on the fence that would really be a good ally to have. So is there something in this collection management system reporting, the capabilities that could speak to these people? Do they care about user metrics, for example? You might say, all these people love our collections. We have all these research questions. Our archives are very valuable. And that's subjective when you say it, but if you can back that up with objective metrics, that's very powerful. So again, just thinking about, is there a way to use collections management systems and their reporting capabilities to advocate for yourself and be really clever about how you do it too? So your hard work should pay off. So at this time, you've done your requirements, you've looked at systems, you've seen demos, you've done a lot of the legwork to get the system. And now it's been implemented, and now it's very powerful. So I hope that this project of implementing a collection management system, I think can help you think about new directions for projects. Where can this system take you? I think too, when you've made a system, you've implemented a system that is very powerful, it's important that colleagues hear about it and they can get more involved in using the system as well. So there might be these colleagues that are going to use any type of database you throw at them. They're power users, they're open to technology, but there might be other colleagues that are a little bit on the fence, maybe are a little leery of new technology or new ways of doing things. But I think if they see the success of the system, they can be brought more on board as well. And I think the good thing about projects is that if you do a good project, there's always other projects to be done. And you might also see that with whatever system that you have, maybe you were limited in how many modules you had or how much capabilities that you had. But if this specific system is very powerful, if it's run really well, you might make the case to expand those functionalities. So let's add another module, or you've seen the success of this project, let's go a little bit further. Let's invest a little bit more in the system. Let's make this even more powerful. So I think it's a really important way to think about, the system itself. Like, the project just doesn't end with implementation. Like, there's always ways to capitalize on all this good work and really make it pay off in ways that benefit archivists and archives.
Thank you for sharing the things we should consider when it comes to implementing collection management system, Margot. There's a lot of high-level factors to think about here when it comes to obviously implementing collection management system. One other thing to think about, obviously, as you can see on the screen, is also digital preservation. Unless you live under a rock, you're more than aware preserving your digital information is an emerging best practice you'll have to think about in the next few years. Well, Margot wrote a book about it called Digital Preservation Without Tears. Not only it is a great introductory book about digital preservation for you, but also a basis for further studies. By getting this book, you will develop an awareness of digital preservation concepts and the ability to communicate issues, and also, as I mentioned, basis for further studies. And lastly, you will feel more confident about the topic around digital preservation, and it is also a great conversation starter when you go to a cocktail event or even a trade show. So just go to our website, it's free. You can download a free copy on that website, lucidea.com/digital preservation without tears. And as mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. There is no one size fits all solution. Each case and each of your situation, we do understand, will be a little bit different. So if you like to leverage the insight you gathered from Margot, or would like to know our solution, more about our solution, pardon me, please feel free to reach out to us. And Margot's is at margot@margotnote.com, and for us, sales@lucidea.com. Our phone number is there as well, and you can also visit both of our websites. Until next time, and have a good day, and thank you for joining us again. Bye for now.